Chapter 6. The trio again thumped along the plank walks on Main Street. A pool of yellow light from two suspended lamps marked the entrance of the bucket of blood. Pat stopped. Ezra pulled up beside him and coughed hollowly. "Reckon I'll need to wash the trail dust out of my bellers," he explained. "Forget it," grunted the sheriff. He knew the redhead's capacity of absorbing liquor. "You fellas hustle down to the livery barn and saddle up," he directed. "Throw the saddle on my sorrel. Meet you right up there pronto." Ignoring Ezra's snorted disgust, he stepped inside the saloon. News of the second hold-up had already seeped into town. A quick glance at the knots of men gathered about the bar told Pat that. The stern set of their features and the deep, serious mumble of their voices bespoke serious discussion. The usual gaiety of Leroux's patrons was absent. Maybe, thought the sheriff, they were wondering if there ever would be another payday. And where was Leroux? Pat scanned the half-empty saloon. With a cautious feeling of disappointment, he sighted the proprietor's tall form on the side wall behind the gambling tables. Although the distance was too great to observe the direction of Leroux's gaze, Pat had a feeling that the hatchet-faced man was covertly watching every move he made. The sheriff drifted across the sanded floor. Silky Shelby was engrossed in a poker game with two hard-faced Easterners and Rowley. Pat wandered aimlessly past the table, stopped and built a smoke, and watched the game. Silky raised his eyes and swiftly scrutinized the visitor, dropping them back to his cards without change of expression. Rolls of fat bulged on Rowley's bull neck as the fat man discarded his hand and twisted his head round. He met the sheriff's blank gaze with a friendly grin. "Here they got another payroll, Sheriff," he announced cheerfully. "For gosh sakes, don't be pinning it on me. Silky here has been lifting my payroll," he chuckled gleefully. Pat nodded and turned towards the door. 3 of his suspects were accounted for. Likely they had a airtight alibi. But that didn't prove they hadn't taken a hand in the hold-up. There was clever planning behind these outrages. The brains in command could hire the tools. Leroux threaded between vacant tables as quickly and quietly as a cat. "Something wrong, Sheriff?" he challenged, approaching, the set smile glued upon his thin features. "Nothing that I can put a finger on," retorted Pat. He saw by the quick fire that burned in Leroux's restless eyes that the saloon man caught the double meaning. But Leroux's mechanical smile continued to function. "We always try to observe the law," he returned glibly. Outside, Sam and Ezra were lounging against the hitching rail smoking. Pat swung into the saddle, and the 3 loped southward. "How's the gang there in the bucket of blood?" inquired Sam, as they left the garnished honky-tonks behind and the ponies' hooves pounded over the crumbling ruts in the road. "Like a bunch of cats just sitting there guzzling the canary," replied Pat. "Leroux, Silky, and Rowley all got nice and slick alibis. Too dang slick." "Did you expect anything different?" rumbled Ezra. Ahead, the shadowed bulk of Coyote Ridge rose out of the plain. A faint breeze rustled the dry prairie grass, and the distant bellow of a cow sounded out mournfully across the flats. Pat sniffed the pungent sage. The peace of the night took his thoughts back to the days before steel came to disrupt men's lives in Powder Valley. Sure, there was plenty of action even in those days, but it was clean action. It was gun against gun. Even a horse thief was a gent compared to these slimy, slick-up artists, and a rustler was a prince. Well, a feller couldn't stop steel no more than he could a stampeding herd. The moon bathed the flats with cold radiance as the 3 angled towards the cut. Smoke drifted from the stacks of the engines on the grade. Its headlight shone upon the dark features of men that hurried back and forth. Pat swung out a leather, a stone throw from the engine, and knotted the sorrel's reins securely around the gnarled trunk of a squat oak. Sam and Ezra followed suit, and the three picked their way over the rock-littered ground beside the track, past another throbbing engine and flat cars, and strode between the confining slopes of the cut. By the wavering lights of flares, a breakdown gang was already working on the wreck. Pierce's was Heavy's form materialized out of the confusion of toiling men. "Cleaned out every dollar," he announced unemotionally, "and killed 2 men. 2 more bashed up quite bad." He led the way to where the engine lay overturned across the cut, indicated the boulder-strewn track. "The buzzards derailed the train, shot Kelly, one of the guards, blew the express car, and then beat it," he explained. "Any witnesses?" asked Pat. "Yeah, we got a break there. Sampson, the fireman, hit the grit when he sighted a block ahead. Says he saw 4 masked men and guessed it was a hold-up. Busted his leg, but he had enough sense to lay. If he hadn't, he would be twanging a harp right about now." "See anything worthwhile?" "He saw him cut down on Kelly and set a charge under the express car. Watched him tote the payroll down the track and heard him galloping away." "That all?" "I reckon so," returned Pierce with a shrug of disgust. "Nothing we couldn't have figured out for ourselves." "This Sampson gent around?" The detective jerked his head towards the end of the cut. "Laid out there in a flat car with the others, and due to pull out any time." "Guess I'll go take a look at him," said the sheriff. Ezra and Sam were engrossed in the salvage operations. He left them staring wide-eyed and hurried back along the track. 2 motionless forms lay on one end of the first flat car, the bodies of the engineer and the murdered guard. Wrapped in blankets, 2 more men were stretchered out on the further end. Beside them, Pat picked out a third man propped up on an elbow puffing a short-stemmed clay pipe. "Are you Sampson?" The sheriff scrambled up on the car. "Well, that's my name," replied the smoker, his features streaked with sweat and dust, glistening in the moonlight. "How's the leg?" "Plain hell, but could have been my neck." "Did you see the hold-up?" Pat dropped down beside the injured fireman. "That I did. If I had a gun, I could have killed them murdering thieves." "You wouldn't know them again if you saw them, would you?" The fireman shook his head. "They were masked, and the dirty varmints, they looked like ghosts with white sacks over their head." "Didn't see a fat feller waddling like a duck, did you?" Sampson glumly chewed the stem of his pipe. "They was all moving pretty slick." "Head east or west?" The injured man's teeth bit into his stem pipe as he eased his roughly splinted leg. "I wouldn't know. I was that mad with poor Nelson scalded to death in the cab. He laughed way back when I told him it was an omen." "What was the omen?" demanded the sheriff quickly. "The winking light, like a evil eye it was." Pat was all attention. "Where? On the track?" "Oh, hell no, in the hills. 3 times it winked. Nelson, I says—" "How far back did you see that winking eye?" cut in Pat. Sampson regarded his leg soberly. "About 5 miles down track, I'd say." "In the hills, huh?" mused Pat. "That's where the rails skirt the foothills." He rose. "All right, so long, Sampson. Good night." Stirrup to stirrup, the 3 partners jogged back through the night to Dutch Springs. Sam, ever impatient, broke a long silence. "Well, what's doing?" Or do we just set and wait for the Jaspers to ride in and say, "Give me a nice sell, thank you kindly"? Pat fished out his watch and squinted at its face in the moonlight. "You just get yourself 3 hours of shut-eye," he pronounced. "We'll lose Ezra on the trail at sunup. Pack some biscuits and some airtights, and fill your water bag. Who's squatting on the old Circle L spread since Nell's pulled out for Arizona?" he concluded abruptly. "June's ranch? No one's around there but pack rats, and what's Nell got to do with that hold-up?" "Plenty," returned the sheriff. "Sampson, the fireman, he saw a signal lamp in the hills about 5 miles back down the track, which is just about the location of the Circle L. Now, if you were figuring on wrecking a train, which I wouldn't put beyond you—" "Nor me," rumbled Ezra. "You'd wait until the right train breezed on ahead," continued the sheriff. "Otherwise, you'd tip your hand to no purpose. So you'd plant a guy to keep cases on down track. When your special train hits the track, this feller could tip you off. Got it?" "I sure do," muttered Sam. "The Circle L is close to Steele. A lookout keeps cases on the track from his ranch house and gives the Jaspers on Coyote Ridge the high signal. And then they got plenty of time to plug the cut." "Well, ain't that runt kind of bright?" boomed Ezra. "He can figure out most anything, after you make it as plain as a wart on your nose." Sam was too engrossed in the possibilities of Pat's suggestion to reply. "Well, then, why don't we hit the ranch now?" he burst out finally. "Likely because the lookout took off after he gave the signal. He'd be crazy to stick around. They seem to have some brains behind these stick-ups." When the first beams of the rising sun glid over the rugged pinnacles of the Cumbrellas, Pat and Sam lazed in their saddles while Ezra, his pony ground-hitched, cast around the slopes before the dark gap of the cut, half bent like a great shaggy bloodhound seeking out scent. It is said that every human being is endowed with at least one talent. Ezra's was tracking. The big, unwieldy redhead could read mire sign with his one eye than Pat and Sam, and they were both good trailmen themselves. Good between them with 2 eyes apiece. "It's the Apache blood in his veins," Sam would want to say when all the other taunts failed to get under the big fellow's skin. Ezra motioned with his arm, and the pair pricked their ponies into motion. "There was 5 horses tied here," he announced. "They was hobbled too. They hit out west at a gallop. 'Pears like a button rode one. Look at his tracks." The redhead was standing by a clump of brush with a slight depression. He pointed a thick forefinger to chaffed branches in the sun-baked ground, scoured and chopped by iron-shod hooves. "What was the markings on the horses?" inquired Sam slyly. "Just like yours," shot back Ezra. "Oversized ears, all the same kind of jackass." "Let's go," broke in the sheriff briskly. Ezra forked his pony and dropped down a gully, then swung west. Eye focused on the trail, he rode at a lope, occasionally pulling down to a walking pace when they crossed a stretch of rock or hit the boulders in a dry wash. About 2 miles from the scene of the wreck, he suddenly jerked to a stop, peeled out a leather, and circled around the sand and sage. "One pulled off right here. Headed for town. A lightweight." "Was he packing the cash?" Pat's gray eyes were eager. Ezra ran a hand through his thatched red hair and squinted fiercely at the ground before him. "No," he indicated finally. "'Twas on the lead pony. See?" He indicated faint impressions. "That critter, he dug in plenty." "Oh, I'd gamble that hairpin reported to LaRoe," said Pat, as they drifted up beside the redhead. Say, what was that you picked up in the sage? It was a flour sack. Ezra held up a small, neatly bundled, secured with a thong. The sheriff shook out the white sack. 2 small diagonal holes had been scissored close to the bottom. It's a mask, he ejected. The hombro who hit for town dropped it. He sniffed the sack curiously and turned it inside out and gave it a careful examination. Pat regarded it with puzzled eyes. Finally, he folded the makeshift mask and stowed it into the saddlebag. Let's ride, he said crisply. Ezra mounted again and led the way, steadily and bearing westward toward the mountain. Throughout the morning hours the sun bit through the shirts of the 3 and burned their backs as Ezra tenaciously followed the trail of the fleeing wreckers. They left the valley floor, and the flat terrain swept into rolling hills. In turn, these were left behind as the landscape changed. Behind them the valley had long since faded in the blue heat of haze. The tough grass thinned, scarcely patched the baked earth, and at last disappeared entirely. The pony's hooves rang upon bare ground, iron hard from lack of moisture. A fine white powder haze drifted sluggishly before them, and powdered riders and ponies, stinging their eyes and prickled their nostrils. Before them stretched the barrens, a heat-blasted, waterless expanse of canyons and gulches, riven hills and rock-littered washes. Beyond towered the grim Cumbrellas, tawny masses of rock, rising cliff upon cliff, pinnacle upon pinnacle, to naked peak and chiseled black against the bright blue of the cloudless sky. Ezra rode slowly now. Alkali gave place to rock. The 3 wound across barren benches and twisted through gloomy canyons. Again and again the redhead came out of the saddle, searching around with shaggy head outthrust like a bird dog flushing quail. Finally, when the sun blazed high overhead, he pulled rein on the brim of a wide dish-like depression, crusted with gleaming alkali and speckled with outcrop and rock, like the surface of a petrified lake broken by the fins of a giant fish. For a while, he quartered the ground afoot, and then returned to his waiting partners with grum features. Signs most petered out, Pat. Seems like they split up right about here. Which trail are we going to follow, if any? You can't hit the trail of the back pony? The flat tone of the sheriff's voice indicated he knew the answer. Ezra shook his head. Rock don't give much sign. There's 3 trails to follow. It's a gamble which one hits the jackpot. Well, I reckon we quit, said Pat. Figured they had split before too long. He ran his tongue over dry lips, caked white with alkali dust. Let's hunt for a patch of shade and feed our stomachs. Trail stained, the trio jogged wordlessly through the dredgy waste back towards Powder Valley. A sense of failure weighed on their spirits. At last the barrens lay behind them. The pony's hooves thudded upon yellowed grass, and the ravines were green-veined with chaparral pinyon clothing the benches. Pat pulled his hard-breathing sorrel to a stop as they topped out on a ridge. The 3 stiffly got out of leather, loosened their dust-matted animals' clinches and rock saddles. The sheriff pulled out the makings and fashioned a smoke and eyed the scene below. At his feet, the foothills rolled smoothly like waves of sea. The valley lay beyond, a vast dun bowl quivering through the rising heat waves. Far off, black smoke from a moving engine smudged the horizon. Idly, the sheriff's gaze wandered southwards towards Coyote Ridge. A drifting dust plume caught his eyes. He stepped back to his browsing pony, slipped a spyglass out of the saddle, and focused it upon 2 ant-like features crawling along the flank of a hill. Hey, Sam, he called. Take a look-see. There's two hombres there heading down for Dutch Springs. Where do you figure they come from? The squat rider grasped the pea glass. Ain't no place they could have come, he replied after long scrutiny, except June Larson's Circle L. Recollection of the injured fireman's ill omen, the thrice winking light flashed into Pat's mind. Hit leather, he snapped. We gotta head off them Jaspers. End of chapter 6.